The first thing Sergeant Cale Morrow ever loved, before the uniform, before the medals, before the 12 years of grinding service that had turned his knuckles into a topographic map of scars, was a dog named Bolt. Bolt was a mutt from the streets of Gdansk, some lunatic crossbreed of shepherd and terrier and probably a dash of something feral. And he had followed Cale home from the market one October afternoon when Cale was 9 years old, padding silently 3 steps behind him all the way through the cold, as if the decision had already been made and only the paperwork remained. Cale's mother had opened the door, looked at the dog, looked at her son, and said nothing. The dog walked in and lay down beside the radiator, and that was that. Bolt was not an impressive animal in any technical sense. He was medium-sized and barrel-chested and had a reddish-brown coat that went dark and rough in the winter and pale and silky in the summer. And he had the particular habit, when Cale was trying to read or study or do anything that required extended concentration, of putting his chin on whatever surface Cale was working on and looking up with an expression that communicated, without ambiguity, that whatever Cale was doing was less interesting than Bolt's company. He was right. Cale stopped trying to argue the point somewhere around age 12. For 13 years, Bolt was present for everything. The fights with his parents that Cale winced to remember. The long, grinding adolescence of a boy who was serious in ways his peers found difficult, and funny in ways that took adults by surprise. The first deployment that never happened because he got appendicitis the week before ship out and ended up in a hospital bed instead of a transport bay, and Bolt was the one visitor who came every day because his mother brought him in her bag. The first deployment that did happen, the leave between them, the second deployment and the third, Bolt waited. That was the thing about Bolt. He waited with a patience that seemed to exist outside of time, in the way that dogs inhabit the present without the future's shadow on it. And every time Cale came home, Bolt was there at the door in the first 3 seconds of it opening. Before Cale's mother, before anyone, tail moving with the specific velocity of a creature that has no mechanism for pretending it doesn't feel what it feels. Bolt died on a Tuesday when Cale was 22, the week before he shipped out for his first extended deep deployment. He buried the dog in the backyard under the crooked apple tree and did not cry, because he had been trying very hard at 22 to be the kind of man who did not cry. He understood later, much later, in the way that understanding always arrives about 15 years too slow, that he had been wrong to try. Not because crying would have been cathartic, though it might have been, because the trying not to had required a specific kind of internal adjustment, the mental equivalent of relocating a piece of furniture so large that the floor retains its shape afterward. A permanent groove, and that groove had influenced the furniture arrangement of his entire interior life for the next decade, in ways he only identified by cataloging the absences. He thought about Bolt on the morning the alien fleet came out of the sun. Not because the timing was poetic, not because he was sentimental. He thought about Bolt because the first alien ship to clear the corona was roughly the size of a small moon, and it moved with the same silent certainty that a street dog follows someone home. 3 unhurried degrees of arc at a time, patient, confident, already certain of the outcome. There was nothing threatening in the movement. There was nothing welcoming in it either. It simply moved the way things move when they know where they are going. KL was standing on the observation deck of UAN Harrogate when the passive sensors tripped. He had a coffee mug in one hand and a personnel report in the other, and he had been, 30 seconds earlier, thinking about whether Senior Corpsman Yeva Drazik deserved a commendation or a disciplinary note for the incident with the coolant manifold. Then the klaxon started and the coffee hit the deck, and every human being on that ship had roughly 4 seconds of complete cognitive silence. The silence of a mind encountering something it cannot yet process before the training kicked in. Contact, said Lieutenant Pruska from the sensor station. His voice was perfectly level, which Cale had always appreciated about Pruska. The man was constitutionally unsuited for panic, which in 12 years of service Cale had come to understand was a rare and genuinely valuable trait. Bearing 027 Mark 12. I am counting, a pause, the kind that happens when numbers refuse to stay still. 1 primary hull, estimated mass equivalent to Titan, and 11 secondary hulls ranging from destroyer to cruiser classification. No, wait, another pause, longer this time. 15 secondary hulls, correction 19. Sir, they are still resolving. I cannot give you a fixed count. Understood, Cale said. General quarters. The Harrogate had 22 seconds from klaxon to full combat readiness, a number she had achieved in drills 11 times in the past 3 months and missed twice. On this morning, she did it in 18. Cale had known she could. There is a difference between what a crew can do and what a crew will do when the geometry of the situation leaves no room for the gap between them. What happened next occupied the next 6 hours and would be analyzed, dissected, debated, and used as the opening chapter of 9 separate tactical manuals over the following decade. Cale himself did not read any of those manuals. He had been there. He did not need the summary, and summaries, he had noticed, had a tendency to organize experiences in ways that made them legible at the cost of making them true. The 6 hours, experienced from the inside, were nothing like the 6 hours described in the literature afterward. The literature afterward had clarity and structure and cause and effect logic. The 6 hours from inside had mostly been the sound of his own pulse, and the specific quality of attention that the body produces when the nervous system decides that every detail might matter. The alien fleet, which humanity would eventually designate the Vreth Kalen, a transliteration of the sound their own communications made when played back through a human audio processor, like stone dragged across ice, did not fire a shot. They broadcast on every frequency in a tight beam pattern that suggested they had been studying human communication infrastructure for some time. They sent a message. It was not in any human language. It was not in mathematics. It was not in music or prime numbers or any of the other things human beings had spent a century assuming a superior intelligence might use to say hello. The SETI community, when the recordings were released, collectively produced the most fascinating collection of wrong guesses in the history of organized guesswork. Cale had read some of the early papers in the months that followed and had found them, without being unkind about it, almost charming in how certain they were, how confident the frameworks, how absolutely sure everyone was that the alien signal must be legible in one of the 3 or 4 registers that human intelligence had imagined it would use. It was in smell. Specifically, it was a precise electromagnetic recreation of a scent, something between iron and wet earth and something else, something sweet beneath the others, almost floral, almost the way a living thing smells when it is very healthy and very still, that human olfactory processing centers, when later mapped by neurologists attempting to understand why every person aboard every ship in the contact zone had the identical reaction, translated into a single unified concept. Go home. Not a request, not an order. More like the kind of thing a dog does in a doorway, plants itself, looks at you, does not bark, does not bite, but communicates through posture and stillness, and the particular set of its jaw a very clear statement about whose space this is. Not aggression, not threat. Simply the pure information of a territory understood by the creature communicating it, offered to the listener as a fact the listener might want to incorporate into their decision-making process. Every commanding officer in the contact zone received simultaneous orders from UN command within 4 minutes. Hold. Do not fire. Do not respond. Wait. Cale held. He did not fire. He did not respond. He waited. The alien fleet waited too. 11 days. Both sides waited 11 days. This number would later be referenced in various cultural and diplomatic contexts as significant, and various people would assign various meanings to it, and none of them would be correct or wrong exactly, because significance is not a property of numbers. It is a property of the minds that observe them. What Cale knew was that 11 days in a contact zone with an unknown alien fleet, with no orders beyond hold and no information beyond what passive sensors could provide, was a very long time to be responsible for a crew of 407 people who were scared and professional in roughly equal measure and who needed their commanding officer to be something they could borrow steadiness from. He ate his meals standing at the observation port. He slept in 3-hour increments on the cot he had moved into the command center. He read the same personnel report 6 more times without retaining a word of it. His crew, to their extraordinary credit, did not panic. They played cards. They ran maintenance drills. Senior Corpsman Drazik fixed 3 systems that weren't technically broken and one that was, and Cale decided she absolutely deserved a commendation. His crew argued about whether the alien ships were beautiful or terrifying, and the answer, Cale thought, was that those were the same thing, and had always been the same thing, and humanity had simply spent so long pretending otherwise that it had confused itself. You do not look at something that could end you and feel either beauty or terror in pure form. You feel both at once, braided together, and what you call it afterward depends on whether it ended you or not. On the morning of the 12th day, the Vreth sent a second message. This one was also in smell. The neurologists would later spend 2 years arguing about the translation. The consensus, insofar as there was one, was that it meant something close to, "Prove you are worth keeping." Kale read the translated briefing in his bunk at Aero 340 and lay staring at the curved metal ceiling for a long time afterward. The ship's environmental systems kept the temperature at a consistent 19 degrees Celsius and the lighting at a consistent 30%, and the sound profile at the low constant hum of life support and navigation, which he had stopped consciously hearing years ago, and now registered only as a kind of floor beneath all other experience. He lay on that floor, figuratively, and he turned the phrase over, "Prove you are worth keeping." He thought about Bolt, the way he always did when he was trying to understand something that couldn't be explained with numbers. The way Bolt would look at him sometimes, just look, not wanting food or a walk or anything particular, just making a quiet assessment that somehow never felt unkind. Dogs do not evaluate you against an abstract standard. They evaluate you against you. Kale had spent 12 years in military service being evaluated against abstract standards, performance metrics, fitness reports, tactical assessments, the accumulated institutional judgment of an organization that had very precise ideas about what a person should be. He had done well by those standards. He had never, in 12 years, felt as unambiguously known as he had felt under the gaze of a medium-sized mutt from the streets of Gdansk. He got up, he made coffee. He went and stood at the observation port and looked at the alien fleet hanging in the dark, and he thought, all right. The phrase was not quite a decision. It was more like the moment before a decision, the moment when you have already finished the reasoning and are waiting for the rest of yourself to catch up to where your mind has already gone. The council that convened 3 days later included 11 nations, the UEN Joint Command, 3 independent contractors with unclear mandates, and 1 person who was not supposed to be there at all. She announced her presence by sitting down in the only empty chair before anyone could stop her, folding her hands on the table and saying, in the particular voice of someone who has spent their entire adult life in places they were not technically authorized to be, "I have better data than everyone else in this room, and I will trade it for 15 minutes of floor time." Her name was Dr. Nadia Voss. She was a xenolinguist and former deep space telemetry analyst from the Farview Institute, which had been officially dissolved 3 years ago after a funding dispute with the UEN, but which had, apparently, been continuing certain activities of its own accord. She was 41 years old. She had very short silver hair, cut with the practicality of someone who had stopped spending time on anything that didn't serve a direct purpose, and the particular stillness of someone accustomed to waiting. She was wearing a jacket that had seen better decades, and she had a data chip in her left hand, and she was looking at Director Calmaine of UEN External Affairs with the expression of someone who has calculated exactly how long it will take the other person to reach the conclusion she has already reached. Kale, who was seated on the military side of the table and had no real stake in whether the council admitted her, watched the 12-second staring contest between Voss and Calmaine and knew before it ended that Voss would win. There is a specific quality of patience that belongs to people who are right about something the other person hasn't yet understood, and Voss had it, in the particular concentrated form of someone who had been right about this specific thing for 18 months, while the institutional machinery around her produced confident wrong answers. She got her 15 minutes. She used 11 of them. The data was extraordinary. The Farview Institute, in its unofficial post-dissolution existence, had been running continuous translation work on the Vreth electromagnetic scent language for the past 18 months, ever since long-range deep-field sensors the Institute had maintained on a skeleton budget in direct contravention of 3 separate shutdown orders, because Voss had looked at the approaching signal profiles 3 years ago and understood that whatever was coming was using language in a way that would take time to map, and time was the one resource you could not retroactively acquire, had first detected the fleet's approach. Voss had built a partial phonemic map, not a full grammar, she was clear about that, not even close to a full grammar. I want to be very specific about what I have and what I'm inferring from it, because the gap between those two things is where people tend to make the mistakes that end badly. But enough to understand the architecture. The language was not, as most specialists had assumed, primarily chemical. The chemical component was, she believed, more like punctuation. The actual semantic content was carried in electromagnetic pulse rhythms riding underneath the chemical signal, at frequencies human equipment had been too focused on the obvious signal to notice. It was like looking at a painting and seeing only the frame, because the frame was brightly colored, and the painting was in a wavelength your eyes had never been trained to register. "They are not asking us to prove our worth to them," Voss said, and the room went very quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when a statement lands that reorganizes everything around it. "They are asking us to prove it to ourselves." She let that sit. She had the timing of someone who understood that certain ideas needed a specific duration of silence to expand into before they could be addressed. The phrase structure implies an observer-reflexive construction. Something like, "Demonstrate for internal recognition your." She paused, choosing carefully, the pause of a craftsperson selecting the right tool, "your capacity to persist." The word I'm translating as worth is closer to the quality of a thing that continues to be. They want to see if we know what we are. Cale looked at the table in front of him for a moment. Then he looked up at Voss. "And do we?" She looked back at him and something very small moved at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile. The ghost of a smile, or maybe the memory of one. That's rather the question, isn't it? The mission was Cale's idea. He would never have called it that. Would have said it was a logical response to available intelligence. But in the debriefs afterward, 6 different people would independently describe it as the moment Sergeant Cale Morrow demonstrated something the Vreth Kalen were apparently very interested in seeing. He requested a solo approach, not the Harrogate, not a fighter wing, not a diplomatic shuttle packed with politicians and translation equipment and carefully negotiated protocols about handshake sequences, though he understood the argument for all of those options, and had in fact made the argument for 2 of them himself before he arrived at the conclusion that he kept arriving at. Him, 1 ship, the smallest long-range vessel in the contact zone, a recon sled called the Inkhorn that had been used primarily for sensor sweeps and had no weapon systems to speak of, which Cale thought was probably the point. Not because it would fool anyone. An advanced civilization that had navigated interstellar space was not going to be deceived by the absence of visible armaments. The point was not deception. The point was statement. The point was, "I know you are enormous and old and I cannot threaten you, and I am coming anyway, in the smallest thing I have. Because I understood your message and I think the right answer to it is not a fleet." "You are going to die," said Admiral Tessin, who ran UEN Joint Command from a carrier 200,000 kilometers away and delivered this assessment with the serene certainty of someone describing weather. Tessin had a quality that Cale had always respected and occasionally found infuriating, which was that she never softened the operational math. You were either likely to survive a thing or you weren't, and she told you which, and she expected you to factor it into your decision without requiring her to manage your feelings about it. "Possibly," Cale agreed. "I am not authorized to approve this. I know, it is tactically incoherent. It's not a tactical move." Tessin was quiet for a moment. It was the kind of quiet that meant she was running the calculation one more time to see if it came out differently. "Then what is it?" Cale thought about the sent message. "Demonstrate for internal recognition your capacity to persist." He thought about Voss's 11 minutes and the specific quality of stillness that had preceded the phrase that changed the room. "It's an answer," he said. Tessin gave him the inkhorn. There was one condition. The council, after Voss's briefing, in a closed session that went 4 hours over schedule, and produced a document that Cale was given a summary of rather than the full text, which was standard practice for things that required plausible institutional deniability, had determined that the approach should include what one committee member had apparently called an ambassador of emotional fidelity. The phrase appeared in Cale's briefing notes without explanation, and when he had pressed for clarification, he had been told simply that the Vreth Kalen's electromagnetic sense signals included recurring patterns associated with terrestrial mammals, patterns that Voss's team had identified but not yet fully mapped, and that the scientific advisory team believed a live animal aboard the approaching vessel might carry significant communicative weight. The phrasing was institutional. The actual thing it was describing was not institutional. Cale had understood that immediately and had not said so in any of the briefings because the gap between institutional language and what it is describing is one of those gaps you leave alone when you are trying to get something approved. The manifest for the inkhorn therefore included, in addition to Kale and his standard loadout and enough food and water for 6 weeks, a dog. Her name was Kess. She was 3 years old, a lean and serious shepherd cross with a tawny coat that went almost golden in good light and a slightly folded left ear that gave her an expression of perpetual quizzical attention even when her face was doing something else entirely. She had been attached to the Harrogate security detail for 18 months. She had participated in 4 zero-gravity acclimatization drills and, according to her handler, Senior Specialist Orantaby, had handled all of them with more equanimity than most of the humans. She had an award in her service file for locating a hull breach that the ship's sensor array had missed, which Tabe reported with the pride of a person describing an achievement they were not allowed to claim credit for, but were very glad it happened. Tabe stood at the loading bay door with his hands clasped behind his back and watched Kale walk Kess up the ramp. He had the posture of a man who had decided to be professional about something and was managing it successfully from the outside in, which is the only way that particular kind of professionalism ever works. He did not say anything until Kale was almost to the hatch. "Sergeant." Kale stopped. "She doesn't like being cold," Tabe said. "Keep the environmental above 18 Celsius and she'll be fine." "Understood." "And she?" Tabe stopped, restarted with the specific precision of someone choosing words because loose ones would cost them their composure. "She gets anxious in the dark. Not in a way that's a problem. She'll put her head on your knee. You can push her away if you want, but she'll just come back, so." "I'll keep the lights on," Kale said. Tabe nodded once, the crisp professional nod of someone finishing a briefing, and then turned and walked back into the ship without watching them go. Kale watched him go instead for a moment before he walked Kess up the ramp and into the inkhorn, and the hatch sealed behind them. The inkhorn was 31 meters from stem to stern and smelled of recycled air and metal polish, and the faint ghost of every human who had ever been aboard her. Kale made a slow circuit of the interior after departure, Kess at his heel, and cataloged everything in the quiet, methodical way he had developed over 12 years of operating in environments where the things that could kill you were frequently invisible until they weren't. 6 days of food and water for 2, though he had been told the fleet was 4 days out at the inkhorn's maximum cruising speed. Emergency kit, communications suite, still patched to Harrogate, though the delay would grow as he moved out. The translation equipment Voss's team had hastily jury-rigged to the communication array, running the partial phonemic map she had developed, capable of analyzing incoming electromagnetic scent patterns in near real time, which was an enormous improvement over what had been possible 11 days ago. And still, by Voss's own assessment, like reading a book through fogged glass in a language you half spoke. There was a handwritten note taped to the communication console in Voss's handwriting. It said, "The grammar is agglutinative, the semantics are context-built, and if you are confused by something they send, the first thing to check is whether the confusion is linguistic or whether the thing itself is genuinely confusing. Both happen. Good luck." And one other thing, not in the manifest, not in any of the official records, tucked into the small padded case he kept in his personal kit, between his spare glasses and a worn photograph of his mother. He had carried for 20 years because there had never been a deployment where he had intended to bring it and it had ended up in his kit anyway, in the specific way that some things migrate from optional to essential without being asked. A crumpled, faded collar that had belonged to Bolt. He could not have explained why he'd brought it. He never tried to. Kess investigated every corner of the inkhorn with systematic thoroughness, approved apparently, and then climbed onto the co-pilot's seat. She was not supposed to be in the co-pilot seat. There was no formal regulation against it, but it was clearly not what the seat was for, and went to sleep. Kale sat in the pilot's chair and watched the alien fleet grow slowly from a cluster of light to something that resolved, degree by degree, into ships. They were not beautiful in any human sense of the word, but they were not ugly either. They were what they were, which was enormous, and old, and built to last, built with the specific disregard for aesthetics that comes from things that have survived long enough to understand that aesthetics are not why things survive. And Kale sat with that for a while, looking at them, thinking about the things Voss had said. Demonstrate for internal recognition your capacity to persist. He thought about his first year in service. The drill sergeant, who had failed him out of advanced navigation training and told him, with a specific precision that had lodged in KL's brain like a piece of metal in old scar tissue, present always, usually unobtrusive, occasionally making itself felt when the angle was wrong, that some people were built for comfort, and some were built for continuity, and Cale appeared to be the latter, and that was not a compliment so much as a diagnosis. He had at 23 been deeply insulted by this. He had at 35 understood. On the second day out, the translation suite registered its first incoming signal. Voss's voice came through the comm from Harrogate, the delay now running to roughly 45 seconds each way, and she was professionally calm in the way that Cale had already come to understand meant she was extremely excited about something she was not yet, sure enough, about to be uncontrolled about. Sergeant Morrow, you are receiving a directed narrow-band transmission from the primary hull. I'm running the analysis now. Stand by. He stood by. Kess woke up, yawned, stretched in the specific extravagant way that dogs stretch, the full body, full extension, front paws forward, spine curved, maximum commitment kind of stretch that dogs perform with a thoroughness that suggests they believe each stretch may be their last and they intend to make it count, and came to sit beside the communications console, tilting her head at it in the way she tilted her head at things that were producing sound she found interesting but not alarming. The signal has two components, Voss said 90 seconds later. The transmission delay compressing the gap of her thinking into something the human ear could not decode. The chemical layer is, I want to be careful here, it reads as something like acknowledgement, recognition that you are approaching. They know you are there and they are noting it. The electromagnetic sublayer is more complex. I am seeing the pattern I associate with the observer reflexive construction. They are asking something about you. About a pause that was not transmission delay. He could tell the difference now. Your relationship to the animal. Cale looked at Kess. Kess looked at the communications console. What kind of relationship? Another gap. The kind that sits at the intersection of transmission delay and genuine uncertainty, and produces a pause that has a different texture from either one alone. The closest translation I can construct is something like, is it with you or are you with it? Cale looked at Kess for a long time. He thought about the 9-year-old boy and the rain and the 3 steps of company. He thought about Tabe's voice on the ramp, precise and careful and managing it from the outside in. Tell them, he said finally, that I'm not sure there's a difference. He watched Voss's team encode the response, a painstaking process of converting a natural language statement into electromagnetic pulse rhythms that approximated Vreth-Kalen grammatical structures, necessarily approximate, necessarily incomplete, the linguistic equivalent of speaking a phrase you half know to someone who half expects you to be fluent and is being generous about the gap, and broadcast it forward. Then he waited. The response came in 4 minutes. Voss took 8 minutes to analyze it. When she spoke again, her voice had changed in a way that was small and hard to define, the way water changes when it goes from very cold to just above freezing. Everything the same, but the property that had been determining the character of the thing had shifted. Sergeant Morrow. A pause. I believe they are laughing. What happened on day 3 was not in any of the tactical manuals. Cale had been awake for 18 hours, not from anxiety, simply from the particular alertness that certain kinds of situations impose, the way the body decides on its own authority that sleep is not currently the most useful thing it could be doing. When the inkhorn's proximity, alert registered something that wasn't a ship. It was a probe roughly cubic in shape, about the size of a large refrigerator, broadcasting on a frequency that the translation suite immediately began analyzing. It had deployed from one of the secondary hulls about an hour ago and been on an intercept course since. It moved with the same characteristic patience as the fleet itself. No sudden changes in trajectory, no apparent hurry, the confidence of something that knows it will arrive when it arrives and that the timing is not the point. Cale did not change course. He watched the probe approach and he watched Kess watch it, and he noticed that Kess did not growl, did not tense, did not do any of the things she did when she was registering threat. She sat with the slightly elevated alertness of an animal that is paying close attention but has not yet decided the thing requires her to do anything about it. He trusted her read. He had been trusting her read for 3 days, and she had yet to be wrong in any way he could identify. The probe matched velocity at a distance of approximately 30 meters from the inkhorn's hull, and stopped. It broadcast a continuous tone that the translation suite processed for 11 minutes, and then Voss's relay delivered the analysis in a voice that was doing its best to stay flat and not entirely succeeding. It's an assessment suite, she said. They are running biological analysis, atmosphere sampling, possibly. They are measuring, a pause, electromagnetic signatures. Sergeant Morrow, they are specifically analyzing the gradient between your biometrics and the dog's biometrics. What are they looking for? I think, Voss said, and stopped and restarted, the stop and restart of someone who has arrived at a conclusion but is auditing it one more time before committing to saying it out loud. I think they are looking for evidence of whether the two of you are distressed by each other's presence. Cale looked at Kess. Kess had put her chin on his knee, and what's the answer? A long pause, in which the transmission delay and Voss's thinking had become genuinely difficult to separate. The answer appears to be no. The probe broadcast one more signal, brief, and then it withdrew in the same unhurried way it had arrived, the way something moves when it has obtained what it came for and has no reason to linger. Voss analyzed it in 6 minutes this time, faster, which Cale had come to understand meant she was growing more fluent in a way that was happening faster than she had expected. It's the observer reflexive construction again, she said, but different. I want to be precise here, so forgive me. The phrase before was, demonstrate for internal recognition your capacity to persist. This phrase is, a pause. It is the same construction, but the object has changed. It is not asking about capacity to persist. It is asking about capacity to, she said a word he couldn't parse, then immediately corrected herself, abandoning it for a longer construction. Capacity to be accompanied. To not be alone in the dark. I think they are asking whether humans know how to be. She paused again, hunting, not lonely. Cale was quiet for a while. How do I answer that? I don't know, Voss said, and she sounded genuinely uncertain, which was the first time he had heard that quality in her voice, and which told him more than the uncertainty itself. I'm not sure you answer it with words. Kess had fallen asleep with her chin still on his knee. He could feel her breathing, the slow, regular rise and fall, the warmth of her through the fabric of his flight suit. He sat in the pilot's chair of a 31-meter recon sled floating in the dark between an alien fleet the size of a small country and whatever was left of human civilization behind him, and he thought about the fact that this was the most accompanied he had felt in 12 years. He kept the lights on. He kept the environmental above 18 Celsius. He did not push her away. On day 4, KL brought the Inkhorn to a stop 12 kilometers from the bow of the primary hull. It was the closest any human being had ever been to a Vreth Kalen vessel. The scale was difficult to process in any intuitive way. At 12 kilometers, the primary hull occupied most of the observable arc through the forward observation port, which on most missions showed a comfortable slice of empty space. Now it showed this. The hull texture, resolved at this distance from what had looked at greater range, like a uniform surface, was something between architectural and biological. It was ridged in patterns that repeated without repeating exactly, the way a living organism's surface repeats. Skin, bark, coral, suggesting structure that had grown rather than been assembled, which was almost certainly wrong as a literal description, but felt true in the way that things feel true when you are close enough to something for the data to become an experience, rather than a report. Light moved across it differently than it would across metal or ceramic or any manufactured surface. It absorbed some wavelengths and reflected others, and the result, in the cockpit's filtered observation ports, was something between gray and green and deep bronze, shifting as the ambient light shifted, as though the hull itself was alive to the changes in illumination and was responding to them. Kess put her front feet on the instrument console and looked at it for a long time. Yeah, Cale said. The translation suite had been running continuously for the past 6 hours, and Voss had been on relay almost continuously, sleeping in 2-hour shifts that her team tracked for her, because she had stopped tracking them herself. When the primary hull broadcast its first direct communication to the stationary Inkhorn, the analysis took 22 minutes, and when Voss came back on, she spoke slowly, parsing as she went, the cadence of someone building a sentence and checking each piece of it before adding the next. There are 3 distinct semantic components. The first is acknowledgement of your arrival at the designated stop point. They noted the distance, the velocity reduction, the final position. They know you stopped where you stopped on purpose, and they are acknowledging that they know. The second is, I want to flag that I have about 65% confidence in this translation, which means I believe it and also mean that you should weight it accordingly. Something about the duration of your approach. The travel time, 4 days. I think they are commenting on the fact that 4 days is a long time to be alone in a small space. The third component, a pause, not transmission delay. The pause of someone who has been looking at something from several angles and is deciding how to describe what they see. The third component is the observer reflexive again, but inverted this time. This time the reflexive is theirs, not yours. They are demonstrating for their own internal recognition something about us, about your arrival. Another pause, shorter. I think this is wonder, Voss said. I could be completely wrong, but the electromagnetic signature of this component, the pulse rhythm structure, I have never seen that pattern in any of their prior transmissions, and I've been listening for 18 months. And the closest analog I can construct in human neurological terms is what we record when someone encounters something they did not expect to find. Beautiful. Kale sat for a moment with that. They think we're beautiful? I think, Voss said carefully, the care of someone who understands that the precision matters. They think the fact that you came with a dog is beautiful, that you didn't come alone. What followed was not, technically, first contact. First contact had already happened 11 days ago when the fleet came out of the sun and broadcast a scent across the electromagnetic spectrum. What followed was something with a less precise name, a conversation, maybe. The first conversation, though even that wasn't quite right, because it wasn't two parties exchanging information in the sense humans usually meant by that word. Linear, declarative, built toward conclusions. It was more like two animals sitting on opposite sides of a fence, each assessing the other with the careful patience of creatures that have learned not to show all their cards at once, that the most important information is usually transmitted, not in what is said but in how the saying happens, in the rhythm and the texture and the things that are consistently absent. The Vreth Kalen sent a representative, not a ship, a single unit, smaller than the probe, moving under its own power, which meant it was something closer to a vehicle than a projectile. It matched position 30 meters off Kale's port bow and rotated to present what Kale eventually concluded was its forward-facing surface, though he acknowledged there was significant uncertainty in that reading. It was, as best he could determine, a vessel designed for one occupant. He never saw the occupant. He was not sure, after 11 days of accumulating data about Vreth Kalen communication, whether the concept of seeing the occupant was one that would translate meaningfully across whatever gap existed between their understanding of communication and his. It broadcast in pulses, short ones. Voss analyzed the first and came back in 6 minutes. It's a name, she said, or the closest analog in their communication system to a name, a designating signal, self-referential, used in first contact grammar. I've seen this pattern in the second message, actually, the one that got mistranslated. The pulse rhythm is, it repeats 3 times, which seems to indicate something about identity that persists, like, I am this, I remain this, I will continue to be this. Kale spent a moment thinking about how to respond in kind. The thing about naming in Vreth Kalen, as Voss had explained, it was not about labels. It was about declaring a continuity. I am this now, I was this before, I will be this after. He pressed transmit and said, into the small microphone of a jury-rigged alien translation system on an unauthorized approach in a 31-meter recon sled. Kale Morrow, Sergeant, United Earth Navy, Harrogate. A pause. And Kess, he pointed at the dog. He understood as he did it how absurd it was. He didn't care. He had stopped being concerned about absurdity somewhere around hour 14 of day 2, when the persistent pressure of genuine strangeness had burned through the social anxiety of looking foolish the way a high fever burns through a headache. Voss translated the response 6 minutes later with something that for the first time since the contact began sounded genuinely like delight. Not unprofessional delight. Not the squeal of someone who has forgotten that they are doing a job, but the specific warm surprise of a scientist who is being shown something they had hoped for but not quite believed. They are asking if Kess is your designating signal or your persistent identity. Kale looked at Kess. Kess looked at the representative unit with the forward-tilted attention of a dog that has correctly identified that the thing in front of her is important even if she cannot parse how. Tell them she's he stopped, started again. The first version had been too simple, and the second had been too complicated, and he sat with it for a moment, the weight of trying to say a true thing in a language that was not built for the specific truth he was trying to say. Tell them she's the reason I came alone rather than not at all. What came back 4 minutes later was not a word or a phrase or a sentence. It was a pattern, a precise, complex, repeating electromagnetic pulse rhythm that the translation suite would not fully decode for another 3. Days in which Voss would eventually describe, with the careful hedging of someone who had learned to be humble in the face of something very large, as the Vreth-Kalen approximation of a concept humans might translate as understood and seen and yes. They spent 8 days at 12 kilometers. It was not negotiation. Kale was not authorized to negotiate, and the Vreth-Kalen, as far as Voss's team could determine, were not attempting to. What it was, insofar as Kale could describe it afterward, was a mutual examination. Both parties were looking at the other and trying to understand what they were looking at, without the institutional scaffolding that normally makes such examination feel safe. No protocol, no agenda, no checklist of agreed-upon items to work through. Just, here is what I am, here is what you seem to be, let's sit with that. The Vreth-Kalen were. This much became clear through accumulated observation and the gradually deepening translation work. Very old. Not individually old. The concept of individual age, as Voss explained it, was not really how their communication system structured things. They did not have, in their grammar, the distinction between the age of a thing and the age of the process that produced it. Everything was continuous, ongoing, accumulated, old as a civilization. Old in the way that means you have made all the beginner mistakes and some of the intermediate ones, and you have been sitting with the consequences long enough to have opinions about them, long enough to have watched the opinions change and change them again, long enough to have stopped being confident about the opinions in the way that young things are confident, and started being something more like cautious, which is not the same thing as uncertain, but is often mistaken for it. Their communication patterns showed, not in anything as simple as vocabulary, but in structure, in the way they built meaning from the rhythm of pulses, in the things they consistently did not say directly, in the particular grammar of what they left to inference. The scar tissue of a species that had, at some point in its history, learned something very hard and chosen to stay learned. The scar tissue was not visible as damage. It was visible as a quality in the way they moved through language, careful in specific ways, avoiding specific patterns, the negative space of choices once made that could not be unmade. What they had learned, Voss thought, and she flagged this as interpretation, personal inference, 3 times in the same paragraph of her report, with the triple flagging of someone who is very sure of something and very aware. That certainty is not proof. Was something about what kinds of things were worth taking, and what kinds of things were not. The Vreth-Kalen were not here to conquer. They had, apparently, done that once, a long time ago, in the early period of their expansion, before the Great Rationalization, which Voss's team was still building a picture of from fragments from the negative spaces in the grammar. And they had the particular absence of interest in it that comes from having already tried a thing and found the result unsatisfying in ways that cost you more than you expected to pay. You do not forget the specific arithmetic of a loss that size. You carry it the way you carry the debt of a decision that was wrong in ways that couldn't be fixed, only built around. They were here because they were looking for something. What they were looking for, specifically, was what Kale had walked onto the inkhorn carrying without knowing it. Not a weapon, not a technology, not a strategic advantage or a trade resource or territorial access or anything else that human contingency planning had spent 6 months modeling and ranking by probability. What the Vreth-Kalen had traveled, apparently, a very long way to find, and had been looking for in each of the 11 other inhabited systems they had visited in the previous 2 centuries. Visiting quietly, observing, broadcasting their scent language to see what answered, was evidence of a specific kind of relationship, not intelligence, not civilization, not power, military or otherwise, the specific relationship between a species and the other creatures it chose to bring along. Kale did not fully understand this until the 6th day. He was running a maintenance check on the propulsion suite, a procedure that involved crawling into a space not designed for human beings and verifying a sequence of readings with a precision tool and an aching back. When the translation unit registered a long-form transmission, much longer and more complex than anything they had received so far. He finished the maintenance check because it needed finishing and because unfinished maintenance had a way of becoming the thing that killed you at the worst possible moment, and then he went to the communication console and waited. Voss spent 90 minutes on it before coming back on relay. The delay had grown enough that it was now 44 minutes between a message sent and a reply received, and he had spent those 44 minutes doing push-ups in the narrow corridor between the cockpit and the service bay. The habit of a soldier who, had learned early that the body needed something to do when the mind had nothing productive left, and the only alternative was the specific kind of restlessness that compounded into anxiety if you didn't burn it somewhere useful. Kes sat at the far end of the corridor and watched him with the politely puzzled expression she used when he did things she didn't understand but wasn't going to make an issue of. She had a very good face for polite puzzlement. "Sergeant Morrow," Voss said when she came back, and her voice had the quality of someone speaking very carefully, because the alternative is doing something that would compromise the professional register she had maintained for 18 months. "I have a reasonably confident translation of the long form. I want to read it to you directly, with the caveats that my confidence is approximately 72% overall, and that several phrases in the middle section are still uncertain, enough that I've used brackets. Go ahead." It begins with the observer reflexive construction. Then, we have observed 11 other persistent civilizations. In each, we looked for the relationship between the dominant species and the species it had chosen to keep. In most of those civilizations, the kept species served the dominant one. In 3, the dominant species had driven the kept species to non-permenin. We did not remain. A pause in which Kale stopped doing push-ups and sat on the corridor floor with his back against the wall. The transmission continues. In none of the previous 11 did we find the thing we were seeking. The thing we were seeking is difficult to encode in this language. We have translated it as the willingness to be made less efficient by love, the willingness to come 4 days through the dark, carrying something small that needs the lights left on. Kale sat on the floor of the corridor. Kes came and lay down beside him. Her weight against his side was warm and specific and entirely present. "It continues," Voss said. "We have looked for this quality because it is the only quality that predicts long-term persistence at civilizational scale. A civilization that values efficiency above companionship will, eventually, optimize itself into something that cannot maintain the minimum relational complexity required to survive second-order civilizational challenges. The challenges that are not external but internal. The challenges of remaining, over centuries and millennia, a thing worth continuing to be. We have observed this outcome 4 times. We came here because preliminary long-range observations suggested your species might have retained this quality, despite significant evidence that you were in the process of losing it. The presence of a dog on an unarmed approach vessel is the clearest evidence of this quality we have observed in 2 centuries of looking." A long pause in which the transmission delay and the weight of what had just been said occupied the same base space. "There's a final phrase," Voss said. "I have high confidence in this one. It reads, 'We will not take your space. We were never here for that.'" Kale sat on the floor for a while. Kess's head was on his thigh. He could feel her heartbeat faint through the fabric, steady and unhurried, the specific rhythm of a living thing that has decided this is a good place to be and sees no reason to revise that assessment. He thought about all the things the Vreth Kalen had apparently seen in 2 centuries of looking. 11 civilizations, 3 extinctions, 4 optimizations into non-perniscent, whatever the other 4 had been. He thought about the particular weight of a word like long-term, spoken by something old enough to mean it without qualification. He thought about Bolt under the apple tree, and the 9-year-old boy walking home through October rain with 3 steps of company, and the way some decisions get made so quietly and so completely that you don't notice you've made them until years later, when you find the shape of them in everything else. The way a dog follows someone home, not because it has calculated the optimal outcome, but because something in it recognizes something in you and makes a decision so immediate and so complete that it happens before the decision can happen. He pressed transmit. "Tell them," he said, "that I want to understand what they were looking for in those other 11 systems, not what they found. What they were looking for. The specific thing. Because if they've been looking for 2 centuries and they think maybe we have it, I want to know what it actually is, not the evidence of it, the thing itself." He paused, and in the pause he made the decision that had been building for 6 days in the same quiet, incremental way that the fleet had approached. 3 degrees of arc at a time, patient already certain of the outcome. "And tell them my dog's name means, I should tell you that, Voss, so you can translate it properly. Kes is short for kestrel. It's a kind of bird. Small, fast, hunts alone, but mates for life. She was named by her previous handler, Senior Specialist Oren Tabe, who I think was trying to tell something and didn't realize it." He cut transmission and waited 44 minutes. Then he waited while Voss analyzed. He knew the analysis would be long. He sat with Kess on the corridor floor, and they both looked at nothing in particular for a while, in the comfortable shared silence of two beings that have been in close proximity long enough that the silence between them has stopped being empty. The response, when it came, took Voss 2 hours to analyze. When she came back on relay, her voice was different in a way that Cale had no words for and would not attempt for. Several years. Sergeant Morrow. The thing they were looking for, the thing they believe your species may have, is the thing they lost. Their own word for it involves the observer-reflexive construction I've been tracking throughout all their communications. It means, as best I can render it in English, the quality of a thing that knows it is not alone and chooses, anyway, to go into the dark. Not because the dark is safe, not because the company makes the dark safe, but because going alone when you do not have to is a waste of the most important resource in a persistent civilization. A pause. The resource is not technology. It's not military capacity. It's not energy or territory or infrastructure. The resource they're describing is the tolerance for vulnerability that comes from choosing to be accompanied. They lost it, they say, about 4,000 years ago, during a period they describe as their great rationalization. They became very efficient. They optimized very thoroughly. They eliminated the friction, the inefficiency, the unnecessary weight of relationships that did not serve strategic purposes. And they survived because they were already old enough and large enough and technically advanced enough that pure efficiency kept them alive, long past the point where it would have killed something younger. But they have spent the subsequent 4,000 years looking for it in other species, because it turns out, Voss stopped for a moment, and when she continued, her voice was very steady in the way that means it is being held steady. It turns out that when you lose the willingness to be made inefficient by love, you also lose something you cannot easily name, which functions like a reason to care whether the civilization persists. Cale looked out the observation port at the primary hull. The hull was shifting in the ambient light of the system's star, bronze and green and deep gray, alive to the light in a way that no built thing should be. And for the first time since the contact began, Cale looked at it and thought not enormous, and not ancient, and not incomprehensible, but alone. He looked at this thing that had been crossing the dark for 4,000 years and understood what the crossing cost and what it had cost them to optimize away the understanding of what it cost. And he felt, for just a moment, the particular grief that belongs to things that cannot be given back. They came here, Voss continued, because they have, in their words, and I'm translating loosely, but I believe accurately, they have been keeping themselves going on purpose for 4,000 years, waiting to find it again in something else, because the loss of it in themselves could not be repaired from the inside. Something that has fully optimized cannot choose to become less efficient. The choice is unavailable. The mechanism for making it has been removed, but contact with something that still has it. She paused. They believed that contact might be a way back, that something old enough to have forgotten what warmth is might, in the presence of a thing that still carries it, remember the shape of the thing they lost. The stars outside the inkhorn were very clear and very cold and very numerous. Kess put her nose against the observation port glass. What Cale did next was not authorized. He would not say, in any of the subsequent debriefs, that it had been an impulse. It had not been an impulse. It had been a decision made in the same quiet way that most real decisions are made, without ceremony, without drama, with full awareness of the consequences and the particular steadiness of a person who has already understood that the right thing is the right thing and the only remaining variable is whether you are going to do it or not. He called Voss on the relay. I need you to encode a phrase, he said, and I need the encoding to be as accurate as you can make it given what you know of their language. I don't want an approximation because it's close enough. I want the real thing as close as we can get. I need you to spend whatever time that takes. A pause. What's the phrase? It's not a phrase exactly. It's more of a... He looked at Kess, who was still pressed against the observation port, her breath making small clouds on the cold glass, fogging it and clearing and fogging it again with each slow exhale. It's more of a gesture. A thing humans do with dogs. You know, the thing where you scratch a dog behind the ears and they lean into it? Not because you're feeding them. Not because it keeps them warm. Not because it makes them more efficient or more capable or more useful. Just because it's good. Because the goodness of it is the whole point of it. A very long pause on Voss's end. The kind of pause that means someone is sitting very still and thinking something large. "I'm going to need you to describe the neurological component," she said finally. "The electromagnetic profile of, the specific kind of present moment contentment that, yeah, give me an hour." She took 53 minutes. The encoding she built was, she admitted, speculative in structure and almost certainly imprecise in ways she could not fully audit. The translation of a physical gesture into an electromagnetic pulse rhythm that approximated a Vreth-Kalin linguistic construction was, she noted, 3 levels of approximation stacked on top of each other, and she wanted him to understand that before he broadcast it. But the electromagnetic pulse rhythm that resulted was, she thought. She said she was not certain, but she thought, the closest approximation the available tools could construct of. This is the moment that makes the dark worth crossing. This is the thing that is its own justification. Kale broadcast it. And then he scratched Kess behind the ears. She leaned into it, her eyes going soft in the specific way that a dog's eyes go soft when they are completely present in a moment of uncomplicated good. And she made a small sound in the back of her throat. Not quite a whine, not quite a groan. The sound of a creature that has received exactly what it was hoping for. The translation suite's incoming buffer registered, 17 minutes later, something that had never appeared in any of the Vreth-Kalin's prior transmissions. Not words, not grammar, not any of the structured communication patterns that Voss had been mapping for 18 months. Building her lexicon and her partial grammar and her 72% confidence in a language that had arrived from 4,000 years of optimized loneliness. A tone, single frequency, sustained 6 seconds. Nothing before it, nothing after it, just the tone, clean and held and very still in the spectrum. Voss analyzed it for 40 minutes. When she came back on, she had clearly been crying. She acknowledged this without embarrassment in the same direct register she used for everything. "I want to flag that before I continue." "Noted," Kale said. "I don't have a translation," she said. "I want to be honest about that. I don't have a translation because this frequency pattern doesn't appear in any of the linguistic data I've built. It's not in the grammar. It's not punctuation. It's not in the observer-reflexive family or any of the other structural categories I've identified. It doesn't fit any of the communicative patterns I've mapped. I have looked at it for 40 minutes and I believe. I want to be very clear that this is personal interpretation. This is Nadia Voss looking at something and saying what she thinks it means based on 18 months of context, not a translation. I believe this is the sound the Vreth-Kalin make when something is new to them, when something has entered their experience that was not there before." She paused. "I think," she said, "that you just taught a 4,000-year-old civilization to remember something. The negotiations, the real ones, the political and diplomatic and strategic ones, took 11 months and involved several hundred people, and produced 3 separate agreements and 1 framework document that would underpin the next 40 years of human Vreth-Kalin relations. KL was not part of those negotiations. He returned to the Harrogate on day 15, after the initial communications had established enough of a basis to bring in the actual diplomatic teams, and he filed his debrief reports, 7 of them, each covering a different aspect of the contact, each read by people whose institutional titles he mostly couldn't recall, but whose questions were, without exception, sharper than he had expected, and sat through 12 separate interviews with people of increasing institutional importance and decreasing institutional composure. And then, with the bureaucratic patience he had developed over 12 years of military service, he waited for them to be done with him. He was promoted twice in the aftermath, both times over his somewhat half-hearted objections, which he was told were noted and filed. He accepted the commendations because refusing them would have required more paperwork than accepting them, and because Tessin told him, with characteristic directness, that refusing commendations for things you actually did was a form of false modesty that wasted everyone's time. He gave exactly 1 public speech at a UEN ceremony he had tried to get out of and failed, and the speech was 4 minutes long and contained very little that anyone subsequently quoted, which suited him. What he remembered afterward was not the ceremony, not the negotiations, not the months of diplomatic work that produced the framework documents that he had contributed to in a peripheral capacity, and which would have happened without him eventually, in some form. What he remembered was the walk down the ramp of the Inkhorn when he returned to the Harrogate on day 15, Kess on her leash beside him, and Senior Specialist Oren Tabe standing at the bottom of the ramp with his hands clasped behind his back and his face in the professional configuration and not entirely managing to maintain it. And Kess had seen Tabe, had seen him from the top of the ramp, from 20 meters away, had registered the specific electromagnetic signature or scent or whatever it is that dogs register when they see the particular human they are most happy to see, and had done the thing that dogs do, that specific whole-bodied ear-forward, tail-blurring explosion of recognition and joy that is about as pure a demonstration of present-moment contentment as any species in the known universe has ever managed to produce. A joy without self-consciousness or reservation, or any awareness that it might be inconvenient. And she had pulled the leash out of Cale's hand entirely and hit Tabe in the sternum with both front feet, and Tabe had gone down on one knee and was saying something into the top of her head that Cale could not hear from 20 meters away and did not need to. Cale stopped on the ramp and watched. He thought about an 11-year-old boy burying a dog in a backyard under a crooked apple tree and deciding not to cry and being wrong about that in a way that had cost him something he had spent 12 years without being able to name. He thought about 4,000 years of very efficient loneliness, of a civilization crossing the dark in beautiful enormous ships that had learned to travel without anything to come home to, and the specific 6-second tone that had come back from the primary hull when they heard the sound of a dog leaning into a hand. He thought about a word that Voss had used once in an early briefing, before she had the grammar to be more precise: accompaniment. She had used it as a placeholder, an approximation, and had later replaced it with more precise constructions. But the placeholder had stayed with him. It had the quality of a word that is less precise than the thing it is standing in for, and also somehow more honest about the thing's shape. He unclipped the worn collar from the case in his kit, turned it over once in his fingers. Bolt's name was still stamped in the metal, the letters rubbed thin by years of handling, by the specific gentle erosion of being held by the same hands over and over again, the way a pebble in a stream becomes smooth, not because anything cuts it, but because something persistent keeps touching it. He put it in his chest pocket. He walked down the ramp. There is a phrase that the Vreth Kalen use, in the diplomatic communications that followed the initial contact, use frequently, in a variety of grammatical contexts, in a way that suggests it is foundational to their understanding of the negotiations and of humanity and possibly of themselves. The way some phrases become foundational, not because they are repeated, but because they become the thing everything else is organized around. Voss identified it early and spent 3 months building the most precise translation she could, going through 16 drafts, each closer to the thing she was trying to describe, until she arrived at the one she felt she could stand behind. It is, in their language, the observer-reflexive construction combined with the persistent identity designation, and the phrase she had initially translated as capacity to not be alone in the dark. In English, in Voss's final translation, it reads, "They are the ones who went into the dark and came back with someone." This is the phrase the Vreth Kalen used in their communication logs when they first registered the Inkhorn's departure from the human fleet. This is the phrase they broadcast to each other, ship to ship, in the hours before the probe deployment, a phrase moving through a fleet the size of a country, carried on the same frequencies as navigational data and engineering reports, and all the other traffic of an enormous civilization going about its enormous business. This is the phrase that appeared in their own records when they made the decision, made apparently very quickly, and with something their internal communications characterized as unusual certainty for a species that made most decisions slowly to treat humanity as what they called, in the closest available translation, a civilization worth keeping. They had been looking for it for 2 centuries, in 11 systems, among a variety of species, some of them technically more advanced than humanity at the time of contact, some of them significantly older, some of them with communication systems far more compatible with the Vreth Kalen's own. They had found, in those 11 systems, intelligence and technology and territorial ambition and fear and cooperation and conflict and all the other things that civilizations produce. They had not found the specific thing they were looking for. They found it in a 31-meter recon sled with no weapon systems and a dog with one slightly folded ear and a sergeant who kept the lights on because an animal he had known for 3 days needed it, and that was reason enough. 12 years later, Cale was teaching at the UEN Academy, which was not what he would have chosen and was not what anyone expected, and was also, as he told the one person he regularly discussed such things with, which was Voss, who had taken a research position at the same institution 2 years prior, and with whom he had developed the specific kind of friendship that begins in shared extremity and continues in shared purpose. Probably exactly right for where he was. He taught advanced contact theory. The curriculum was dense with technical material, translation methodology, electromagnetic communication systems, xenolinguistics theory, the full academic apparatus of a field that had grown enormously in the decades since first contact, that had gone from a theoretical discipline to an operational one, that had people with funding and salaries and institutional homes and, occasionally, the specific profound confidence that comes from having a framework that works. He taught all of it competently, with the particular competence of someone who has read the material and also been there when the material was made. Who knows what the equations were trying to describe, because he was one of the things they were describing. The part of the curriculum he had written himself was the last session of the semester. He did not use slides for this session. He did not use a lecture format. He sat on the edge of the desk in the old-fashioned way, the way instructors had sat on desks for as long as there had been desks and things to teach from them, and he talked for 2 hours about the specific event and the specific conditions that had produced it, and the things that could not have been planned for, and the things that had prepared him for it without his knowing they were preparations. Then he took questions. Then he answered the questions as directly as he could, which was more directly than most people expected from a 2-star admiral, and which consistently surprised the first-year students who hadn't yet learned that rank in this particular classroom did not function as a shield against direct answers. The question he got most often from students who had done the reading and thought hard about it, and arrived at the place where thinking hard leaves you, which is a doorway, not a room, and you have to go through it yourself, was, how did you know? How did you know to bring her? How did you know that was the right thing? He answered this question the same way every time. He said, I didn't. He said, I had a dog when I was 9 who followed me home from the market, and a drill sergeant at 23 who told me I was built for continuity, which at the time I thought was an insult, and which I later understood was a description of the same thing. I had 12 years of service that taught me the difference between a tactical situation and a situation where tactics aren't the primary instrument. I had a xenolinguist who was better at her job than almost anyone I've ever met, and who told me she didn't know how to answer the alien question in words. And I had a dog who had been calmer than I was at every point of the mission, and who kept putting her head on my knee when the situation was very large and the ship was very small. He said, none of those things were a plan. They were just what I had. The only decision I made was to go alone rather than not at all, and to bring what mattered rather than only what was approved. And those turned out to be the right decisions, not because I calculated that they would be, but because they were consistent with the things the Vreth Kalen were looking for. And the Vreth Kalen had spent 2 centuries developing a better understanding of what those things looked like than I had. And then usually a student would ask, but why did it work? Why did the dogs specifically work, as opposed to some other kind of demonstration? Why was that the thing? And Cale would take a moment with this, because it was the question that mattered, the one that the technical material and the academic frameworks and the institutional language could gesture toward but could not finally answer. And then he would say, because the Vreth Kalen had been watching 11 civilizations for 2 centuries, and they knew what intelligence looked like, and they knew what technology looked like, and they knew what military capacity and territorial ambition and fear and cooperation and all the other things that civilizations build and deploy looked like. And none of those things had been what they were looking for. What they were looking for was something much older than any of that. Something that predates the earliest civilization any of us can name. Something that operates in the register of, here is a thing, and I am with it, and I am going into the dark, and I am not going alone. He would look out the window for a moment, at the academy's courtyard where students were moving between buildings in the particular unhurried way of young people who have somewhere to be and enough time to get there. And he would say, they were looking for whether something in us still knew that the dark is longer and colder if you cross it alone, and whether we were smart enough or stubborn enough or sentimental enough not to have optimized that knowledge away. And we were. Barely, but we were. He would not say this last part to the students, but he thought it, consistently, in the moment between saying we were and moving on to the next topic, We were because someone 9 years old stood in an October rain and let something small and cold and not his follow him home. And enough of what that was had survived everything that followed. The deployments, the promotions, the 12 years of service, the specific kind of efficiency that military life rewards and enforces, to make it out the other side. It had survived not because it was protected, but because it was the kind of thing that does not need protecting. It had survived because it was the foundation the whole structure was resting on, invisible until the structure was tested in a specific way, and then suddenly the only thing that mattered. That is not the kind of continuity you can teach in a classroom. But you can, maybe, remind people that it exists. In the UEN Academy's main corridor in the building that houses the Department of Contact Theory and First Encounter Protocol, there is a small bronze plaque on the wall outside Lecture Room 14. It was installed in the 7th year after the Harrogate contact, paid for by a private donation whose source was never officially named but which 3 separate administrative assistants independently and privately attributed to a former analyst from an institute that had officially stopped existing a decade ago. The plaque reads in English, and below that in the electromagnetic pulsotation that Voss's team developed as the standard written representation of Rethkalen phonemic structure, the ones who went into the dark and came back with someone. Below the plaque, in an alcove that is precisely the right size for what it holds, there is a water bowl. It is changed every morning by the building's facility staff, who have been doing this without instruction for 11 years, ever since one of them noticed that the dogs that came through the building in the first months after the policy was introduced would stop at the alcove, and he had thought it would be a good idea and had simply started doing it. The policy was introduced quietly, without ceremony. In the same year, the plaque was installed, in a memo that cited no specific authority and required no formal approval because no regulation had ever been written that prohibited it. The memo was 3 sentences long. It noted that the Department of Contact Theory and First Encounter Protocol was the only UEN institution whose founding event had involved an animal companion, that this origin was worth acknowledging in the department's daily operations, and that effective immediately, dogs were welcome in the building at any time. The memo was signed by one Cale Morrow, acting in his capacity as department head, and contained exactly 1 sentence of justification. It read, in this department specifically, it seems appropriate. The water bowl is used throughout the day by dogs of many varieties, the large and the small, the serious working breeds and the obvious companions, the old dogs that move slowly, and the young ones that have not yet learned to move any other way, the students and faculty who bring them to the building, the visitors who do not know about the policy until they arrive and are told that yes, of course, please come in. All of them use the bowl, and the bowl is full, and the alcove below the plaque is the warmest spot in the corridor because of the specific electromagnetic readings that Voss's team noted in their final report, the residual traces of 6 seconds of sustained tone broadcast from the primary hull of an alien fleet that had been crossing the dark alone for 4,000 years. No one has officially explained this. There are 17 competing theories in the academic literature. Cale, when asked, says he has no opinion on the theories. He says some things mean what they are, not what we say they are. He says, she was a good dog. And then usually he changes the subject.